My name is Father Gabriel Pivarnik. I'm the director for the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies and the vice president for Mission and Ministry here at the college. I'd like to welcome all of you to what is our St. Albert the Great Lecture. This lecture is part of a series of endowed lectures put on by the center every year that's made possible by the graciousness and the rather large endowment that was given to us by Ed Quinn and his wife Kathleen Riley Quinn. So we're very grateful for their support and what they've done for us over the years. I'm indeed pleased that this particular year we're able to invite Chris Rein here to be with us to talk about the Encyclical Laudato Si. As many of you know, this was an encyclical that put forward earlier this year, and we've had a reading group studying that document over the course of the last couple of months. Some of whom are here this afternoon, and some will be coming in a little bit later. I just received messages from them. But part of this, I think, is our own kind of anticipation of looking at what Pope Francis has been teaching us and telling us over the last few years, and of our own need to respond in different ways, not only to what the climate demands in terms of our changing world, but also what human relationships demand in terms of what we owe our Creator and what we owe each other. Sound effects I couldn't control, but hey. So let me introduce to you our speaker for today. Chris Rein is a senior manager and biological scientist actively focused on environmental stewardship and sustainability initiatives. He is strongly committed to natural resource conservation and the sustainable multiple uses of natural resources. He deeply appreciates and understands the interconnection between innovation technologies, economic realities, and resource protection policy and regulation. He was educated at the State University of New York, College of Environmental Sciences and Forestry, and the New York Institute of Technology. He worked as the principal and senior vice president for the ESS Group, an environmental consulting and engineering company, for the past 20 years. He has provided expert testimony at State Siting Board and Regulatory Commission case hearings on matters related to air quality, water supply, and fisheries. Most recently, and I think even in the last few weeks, he has become the executive director for the Friends of Herring River. He also serves as a council member on the Rhode Island Marine Fisheries Council and as chairperson of the Bluefish and Weakfish Advisory Panel. Please join me in welcoming Chris Rein.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Father Gabriel. Thanks also to Father Mark Knoll, who put me in touch with Father Gabriel earlier this year to arrange for my appearance here. Thanks to all of you for attending. Thanks to the Quinn family for sponsoring this. I appreciate that an awful lot. And welcome. I will say, just in getting started, that for those of you who are familiar with the encyclical, there's a lot in it, and it's all interesting. I can't present my opinion on every point in the encyclical, or we would be here for several days, but I did try to choose some things that are very pertinent to the work that I've done for the past 20 years, and hopefully some of those remarks will resonate with you, and we'll leave enough time at the end for some question and answer. So I'm a career environmental scientist, and I've had the very good fortune, I think, to have been raised in the Catholic faith. I have quite a number of religious in my family. I worked in our church rectory when I was a young man, and I've always been probably on the plus side of the faith meter. If you put the needle in the middle, I'm usually over on the plus side, and that has been a wonderful thing for me, but it's also difficult in the professional world, and I see a lot of young people here tonight, people who are still students who may be seeking job opportunities, and I think one of the things that I really love about this encyclical is it's allowed me to connect my faith with my business in a way that I have never experienced before. So I think that's really kind of the best part about the encyclical for me, but we'll get into some more details later. My academic pursuits were really shaped by what is generally known as the first Green Day, Earth Day, back in 1970. Had a lot of great high school science teachers at Holy Trinity High School on Long Island. I don't know if we've got any Long Islanders here. And I was a Boy Scout, and you know, the Boy Scouts and their commitment to training young men to be out in the environment and appreciate nature was really a big influence on me. So I wanted to get a little bit of kudos to the Scouts for that. And then, you know, lastly, my perspective on this is that I just love what Pope Francis has done about connecting caring for the poor and caring for our environment. And I'll touch on this a little bit later, but many of the projects that I've worked on over my career have been subject to review under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And one of the key tenets of NEPA is to examine environmental justice issues. So it's great to see that the Pope has connected with that so intensely in the encyclical. Whoops, sorry about that. Let's just do page down here. There we go. Okay, so the message from the encyclical, or at least the message that I take away, is in two parts. It's a call to all of us to participate in the new dialogue about how we shape the future of the planet. And you know, the planet has been around for a long time, and I think we all hope that it's going to be around for a lot longer time. And quite frankly, a lot of damage has been done, but it is certainly not too late for us to all get involved and do our part to really become a community that cares for the environment, that cares for, as Pope Francis says, our common home. And so the encyclical really is a platform for us to get together and figure out ways that we can sustain our human population in a way that levels the playing field for all of us, that allows us to enjoy not only the beautiful things that we have here in America, in Providence, Rhode Island, at Providence College. We've got, you know, we got lights, we've got heat, we've got wood paneling, we've got technology. But how do we make sure that everyone else in the world gets some of those things too, while maintaining our care for the resources that the world has given us? I guess one of the things I would be remiss if I didn't say it as a lifelong scientist is that I was very impressed by how well researched Laudato Si really is. There's a lot of critically based science that informs the encyclical. And I made some, early on in my reading of it, I reached out to some folks that were involved in researching the encyclical, including Dan Misla down in Washington. I don't know if any of you know him, but he's with the Catholic Climate Center. And, it's impressive how technically competent the encyclical is. And I think that the beauty of that is it really allows us to feel confident that the Pope is right on with this message, that there's not a lot to dispute in this message. It's not the kind of theological document that a lot of people are going to be saying, well, that's just a bunch of hoo-ha. Now, that's not to say that scientists don't ever debate facts either, but I just feel very, very happy that it's so well-based in science. And then it's really relevant to and is already being embraced by the public and by the scientific community and by environmental regulatory agencies and energy regulatory agencies. The White House has put out statements on Laudato Si. US EPA has, really commented favorably on the encyclical. And as a practitioner of environmental regulation, it's very heartening, again, for me to be able to see that my faith, my church, my community is making an impact in at least in our country, on the regulatory community that considers questions regarding the environment. I want to touch a little bit on technical innovation. There's quite a few references to technical innovation in the encyclical, and it's interesting how you can look at technical innovation in different time frames. Once upon a time, having a coal-burning power plant was the best thing for the human community that could have ever happened. I mean, we needed hot water, we needed lights, we needed electricity, we needed a dependable way to power our factories and make the kinds of goods that brought civilization from, the Dark Ages and up until now. And so, it was coal-fired power was a wonderful thing, but it's time that we move on from that, because it's probably not the best thing for us now. As an example, Narragansett Bay Commission uses wind power now to provide the energy that it needs for wastewater treatment. So, being residents here of Providence, you're probably familiar with their wind turbines down near the Providence Harbor. And the beautiful thing about that is not only are they generating their own electricity, but they're using it then to clean up the wastewater that that we produce by our lives. And so it's a beautiful blend of technologies that helps us to take care of the environment by using environmental responsible means to clean up after ourselves. So I think that's the kind of innovation that is in the current frame that's really, really great. Solar power is really making a big boom. 5 years ago, even, certainly 10 years ago, if somebody said, I want to do a large solar-powered facility here in New England, you would just get laughed out of the room. I mean, you really, nobody would take you seriously. And yet now with the coming down in price of solar technology and the increased understanding that, it doesn't have to be sunny every hour of every day. You don't have to live in Arizona to generate solar power. We now have some pretty large solar installations here in New England. Some of them are 3 to 5 megawatts of electricity. That's a lot of power. But nonetheless, that technological advancement still has environmental costs to produce the technology, photovoltaic cells, wires and cables and all of those things. And there's a downside too, an environmental downside to producing those kinds of technologies. So we're on a continuum when it comes to technical innovation. And I think a challenge, of innovators of today is how do we continue to produce better products that help us live our lives while caring for the environment, minimizing the use of our resources, or at least maximizing the reuse of them. So here I wanted to talk a little bit about the National Environmental Policy Act and how it meshes well, actually, with Laudato Si. In the beginning parts of the encyclical, Pope Francis cites a quote from Pope Benedict that the misuse of creation begins when we no longer recognize any higher instance than ourselves. And I think, that is the kind of world we live in today. We live in the world of uber competitiveness. We live in a world where everybody wants to do it faster, better, cheaper, with a bigger profit margin. And I don't want to sound like a doomsday guy. I understand. In fact, people that are business majors would say, well, what's wrong with that? And I would argue that there's probably nothing wrong with that, as long as you can use your brain to figure out a way to do all those things while protecting our world, protecting our environment. So I think the nice thing about Laudato Si and the way that it meshes with NEPA is we already have a federal law in this country and many state laws that spawned off of NEPA that require any federal action to examine the comprehensive costs and benefits of any development. So if, I'll use an easy example for me. If a client came to me and said, I want to build a new power plant, and I know I have to get this permit or that permit, and I have to control my air emissions, and I have to have fuel supply and all those things, a project subject to NEPA would say, well, okay, you have to tell me what those kind of traditional environmental impacts are, but you also have to examine environmental justice, and you have to examine the price of degradation of visual impacts, and you have to tell me whether or not any particular population in the community is going to be adversely affected in a different proportion than any other part of the population. And so, so I think that, that's a beautiful thing. NEPA was, 1970 was when the National Environmental Policy Act came out. And to me, I think that that's a very forward-looking thing, because now we're talking in 2015 about, really analyzing things such that we don't, the upside for us isn't the only thing that's considered. And I'd say that NEPA and its sister regulations provide all of us an opportunity to, going back to what the Pope asked us to do, to help shape our future. We need to become, in more ways, active in our community, active in the decisions, the development decisions that occur. We have to try to find a way to not passively sit by and let things happen just because, they might not be in our backyard. The Pope talks about and criticizes in the Encyclical perhaps a lack of interest in our community, in our faith community, and I think that there is some of that for sure. I think people get tied up with their lives. They have families, they have school, they have jobs, they have problems, and we all do. And so sometimes caring for the environment goes pretty well down the list of things to do. But coming at it from the career that I've had in regulating and evaluating the impacts of development projects, one of the things that you find is that the lack of interest maybe is not a lack of interest. I've been at public meetings where I'm representing a development client, and 500 people are in the room, and they all want to hear about the development, and they're all concerned about what's going to happen. But when it comes to comment periods on permit applications, we find very insignificant comments. Maybe only 20 people write comments in after 500 people showed up in the room. And after doing this for 30 years, I found out there are reasons. One of the reasons is they don't have the funding. How a project developer comes in, he has a budget of $30 million to develop a project. Well, it's easy for him to spend $2 or $3 million to evaluate the environmental impacts in a way that supports his project. And I'm not criticizing that. That's certainly a legitimate part of the business world. But the community doesn't have $2 or $3 million to do similar studies that might get different results. And so, sometimes it's lack of funding, not lack of interest. Oftentimes it's lack of technical expertise. Not everybody is trained as a scientist. People have other academic and professional pursuits, and so, maybe they don't understand the real technical issues. Maybe they don't understand when somebody says, well, we're only going to emit, 125,000 tons of carbon a year. They don't know what that means. They don't know, is that a lot? Is that a little? How does it compare to other things? So they need technical expertise. And they need time. it takes time to study. It takes time to do environmental analyses. And so I just feel like, that's one area of the encyclical where I feel like, maybe a little bit more could have been devoted to that discussion. Now there are states that require developers to provide intervenor funds to enable the public to make its case. In New York State, under their power regulations that consider the environmental impacts of new power plants, there's a formula, and I forget what the number is, but most projects of significant size, the developer has to actually put up $300,000 or $400,000 or $500,000 of funds that are used by the intervenors to the project to do their own studies. And so I think that's a really great start in getting this dialogue and getting this sharing of the burden of caring for our common world, because you're taking away one of the big factors of lack of funding. You're actually, if you want to develop something, you put up the money to develop it yourself, and you also put up some money to allow people who may want to examine it to do their own examination. So I think that's a great thing. One of the downsides in this whole NEPA process is public notice provisions often favor developers. They have, many of these regulations are, legislated by state legislators, federal legislators that, don't have a day in, day out faculty or facility with permitting of large developments. And so, they'll say, okay, so for public notice, you just have to run an ad in, the primary local paper for one day or 1 week. Well, really, how often do you pick up the newspaper and read the classified ads to see if anybody's developing a new project? So I think that, that's a flaw in our system. And, trying to tie this back to the reason we're here talking about Laudato Si and the Pope's urging for us to get involved, I just throw this question out there. Should or can the church play a role in getting the word out? Instead of relying on, 2 inches of small type in a classified section of the paper, should our religious community make some statements to get people out into the mix? So that first half there really talks about, the encyclical and the kind of the regulatory process and community involvement. Now I just want to talk a little bit a little bit more on the scientific end. Climate change changes everything. I think that, to me, the meat of caring for our environment in the short term is really all about what can we do to begin to stem the tide of climate change, if we can do anything at all. And this is where you might get some scientific debate that, hey, climate change is going to happen whether people are here or not. And I think that that may be true, but there's no question that people have helped to accelerate those kinds of changes by changing our atmospheric environment. And I personally believe that. And it's not just the environmental aspects of it. It's not just plain and simply air quality, but it's the social, economic, political, there are health reasons to improve our air quality. There are issues regarding environment that cause people to be unhappy or be maybe even depressed about their environment, such that they don't relate to each other in a way that is good for one another. And those kinds of social things are really, I'm not a social scientist, but I think that there's worth an examination of that. And how do the conditions that you live in, your environmental conditions, change your outlook on life, the way that you relate to your neighbors, the way that you communicate to your community. I think that, speaking more closely to the issue of the science, as climate changes, as people's environment changes, there's great risk to certain groups, and particularly our subsistence populations, the ones that are still hunter-gatherers or opportunistically raising crops in places, people in the Arctic that are relying on marine mammals that live in the Arctic areas for their food sources, that now find that those mammals are having a hard time surviving. Polar bears are now doing a lot more swimming than they used to do because the ice sheet is melting. And so I think there's a real risk to those kinds of populations and communities that I believe we owe it to them to help solve the climate change issue. If not, they have to move, and they may not be able to survive where they move to because they may not fit in socially. They may not be able to eat the kinds of foods that are available. You just can't pick people up and move them from the Arctic Circle and bring them here to Providence and start feeding them Burger King. That's not going to be good for them. So we need to do something about the climate change issue that helps us to protect those subsistence populations. And developed nations, on the other side of the coin, 180 degrees on the other side, we have all kinds of resources at our command, but now we're finding that we will have to invest a tremendous amount of money and time to prepare ourselves to be resilient to the climatic changes and the potential sea level rise. And quite honestly, those funds, if not having to be dedicated to that, could be used for other social good to help support underprivileged people and underserved communities. So I think there's another big factor in why we need to wrestle with climate change and try to do something to slow it down, if not to reverse it. The breakdown of society, this one is, I'm probably on dangerous ground here, but it might stimulate some good questions from the audience. But, it's very interesting that the influence of the digital age is really a double-edged sword. I don't remember who told me this story. It's sort of a secondhand story, but somebody relayed to me a story about, some parent went out in the yard to watch the recent eclipse where we had that blood moon and the beautiful red of the moon during the eclipse, and they went inside to encourage their child to come out and look at it, and he goes, "Oh, I already saw it, it's on the internet." I don't really need to see it real because I've already, I've been there, done that, I'm on to something else. Well, the internet's a beautiful thing. It allows people who have never seen these things to see them, or who may never be in position to see them. We were at a celebration of the winter solstice last year, and it turned out that there was an exchange student had come from one of the cities in China, and I won't remember where, but we were out watching the sky, the winter sky on the winter solstice, and this young person was there, and afterwards they said, "That's the first time I've ever seen stars. I've never seen stars before. Where I live, we can't see stars. There's too much air pollution to be able to see the sky." So, there's a real value in being able to see it real, to see it live. Lack of physical contact with the natural world, kind of numbs us or makes us think, well, it's not really that important. It's out there. We know that. We know we have to have air to breathe, but we just don't. We're too busy to spend time out in the natural environment, and I think that just leads to, again, a breakdown of social health. And I think firsthand exposure to both the good and the bad is very critical for us as we try to educate one another in how to protect the environment and help us to develop that moral compass of how to protect the environment and why we should protect the environment. And I think about a couple of weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, there was a big, two actually, dam failures in mining operations down in Brazil. And, people were killed, villages, I think the number was some 30-odd small villages in Brazil got wiped out by the breakdown of this dam that was used to hold back liquid mining waste and slurry-based mining wastes. And that was terrible. And it's not just Brazil and underprivileged people in Brazil that are experiencing this kind of thing. Is an energy company in the South that had their own dam failure of a coal sludge waste pond a few years ago, and it went from North Carolina all the way into Virginia. I mean, polluted water in several states for a long distance. And I think that, we need to be able to see some of that stuff firsthand to understand why it's worth making the effort to understand our natural environment and protect it. Anybody can look at a picture of a beautiful forest, the redwoods in California, or, look at a picture of snow-capped Mount Washington and say, that's good. But unless you've, seen what the bad side is, it's hard to really weigh the pros and cons of using our natural resources. So I feel that one of the things that came out of the encyclical is preservation. Pope Francis says we can't just wantonly keep using the resources that we have. We can't, burn down, 10,000 acres of rainforest and grow sugarcane or raise cattle for steaks, and then just when that's used up, go ahead and do some more. And so my feeling is that one of the things that we can work for that is a cause that many of us can easily access is natural preservation, preservation of wild areas, preservation of areas that have not yet been spoiled by human activity. And one could argue that there is no such area, and there aren't very many here in the Northeast U.S. because even when you go up to Mount Washington, there's a whole array of cell towers and what have you on the top of Mount Washington. But nonetheless, I think it's important for us to consider preserving large natural areas, and there are reasons for that. One of them is that they provide us with a model to how to restore our environment when we get the opportunity. And as Father Gabriel mentioned, I recently have become the executive director of the Friends of Herring River. We've got a project, the Herring River Restoration Project, that is going to essentially undo 110 years of environmental degradation that was caused by putting a dike across a saltwater tidal marsh estuary out on Cape Cod. And among the impacts from that was a herring run that was over 1 million fish in 1908, the year before the dike was built, is about 16,000 fish now, 110 years or so after the dike was built. And so one of the things that we're doing at Friends of Herring River is we've looked a little, and not very far afield, but another location in Wellfleet that has an undamaged, unrestricted salt tidal marsh where herring run. And basically, we are going to try to take the dike down and replicate what's over on Blackfish Creek in the Herring River. And I think that, so that's something that we can all get involved in, because those are community projects. Those are largely volunteer restoration groups that try to achieve local restoration of things in their own community. Secondly, we need an educational laboratory so that we can have more firsthand contact to understand our common home. this kind of gives me an opportunity to go back to the Boy Scouts. Just this past weekend, I was able to go out with my son's scout troop, and we were able to camp in upstate New York, and we went out, or some of us went out in the middle of the night and were able to see stars, very, very beautiful stars. And it struck me while I was watching them, and I was thinking about this lecture is, that gave me such a connection, not only to the environment, but also to all of the people who have ever lived on the earth. I mean, the constellations that you look at today are constellations that were discovered by people and named by people, thousands of years ago. So it's a wonderful, that's one of those touchstones of our environment that, people should endeavor to get out and see and to get a better sensitivity to our home. And then, the third point is natural areas, protected natural areas, to give us a hermitage, a retreat place, someplace where we can go and really spend time to get into communion with our Creator. And I think that there's no question that, aside from our own mortal lives that were given to us by God, the world that we live in is the next great gift of God. And so it makes me happy to, offer this opinion about the importance of preservation. And with that, I am ready for questions and comments, and I hope that you found something interesting in my remarks about how the Encyclical is affecting at least my work as an environmental scientist. Thanks. Yes?
I have a few questions, but one small and... I had several questions. A couple of them are larger questions, but one small question that arose in an early slide where you talked about and applauded the Narragansett Bay Commission for using wind power to handle its wastewater treatment. But if we were really taking a comprehensive view at that, we might ask, why the wastewater? Why do we have to process as much wastewater as we do? After all, that wastewater came from our showers and our baths. It came from our sanitation stream. That sanitation stream came from, we took potable water.
Yeah.
We took potable water and we used a gallon or two of it to flush our waste down the drain. I wonder if some of the resources that we're putting into what I would think are politically popular solutions,
Yeah.
wind,
Yeah.
might be used to control the load in the first place.
I think that's a great comment, and I totally support that remark. I mean, again, there's a lot to the Encyclical that, I could have chosen to speak on, but I think that is right on, and I would encourage all of us, but particularly people who are, beginning to think about how they can make their contribution to caring for our world, exactly those kinds of things. Composting toilets are an alternative that, will really decrease the amount of wastewater that you have. There may be other things yet unthought of and uninvented but absolutely, I think waste minimization at the source is certainly better than pollution control at the end pretty much any day. But the point of the slide was to show how we're on this technology continuum, and we should be aiming for a closer and closer, better use of our resources, which I think you got right at that point.
Yeah, we don't have to use that 1 or 2 gallons. Our
Yeah.
lab at Providence College has actually developed a toilet valve that flushes on just a cup of water, and
Yeah.
that water comes from the prior user's hand wash.
Right.
And so that's also technology. It's low tech, but it's also technology. May I ask one more
Yeah,
one
sure.
other question?
Yeah.
I really enjoyed your comments about the regulatory process, the review process. I just wonder how realistic it is to expect that people like us in this room can actually muster the resources, the time, the energy, the applications for funds to respond to the developer
Yeah.
proposals. And developer is always used, it's a pejorative word. I don't
Yeah.
mean to use it that way. But isn't that what we pay our taxes for, to have our review boards and so on look at things from the perspective of people rather than in addition
Yeah.
to the individual sub-optimized interest of the
Yeah.
developer.
Yeah. Oh, again, I think you're right on, and obviously, very intuitive about the kinds of challenges in the regulatory arena. What I found, and I've had, I think I'll call it the good fortune to have worked in exactly that business sector for over 30 years, is that regulators are people too, and it's not a perfect world. I think it's wonderful to expect that the regulators will always make the educated, proper decision to help arrive at a win-win situation, let's call it, for the developer and the community. But one thing, kind of using a cliche that might resonate with people, the squeaky wheel does get the grease. And so regulators are sitting and they're listening to the developer tell his story. And again, I don't use developer with a negative connotation, only to imply that, let's call him the project proponent. The regulators hear firsthand from them, and they hear early and often from them. And if the regulators don't hear a lot from the community, they get lulled into sleep that the community doesn't believe that this is critically important. And so they will tend to make decisions that will allow the development. And in some cases, that's what should happen. But in other cases, sometimes it doesn't work that way. So in an ideal world, yeah, you're right. We would pay our tax bill, and our regulators would always make the right balance of win for the developer, win for the environment, win for the community. But in my experience, it hasn't worked that way. And so the way that I see, at least in the short term, to try to provide better balance there is for people to use their right as a community member to speak out and try to question things. So, but I like your question, and I'd love to be able to solve that in my lifetime. Yes.
I just had two quick questions. The first is the Catholic Church has two well-established beliefs. One of them is the right to own property, and from Genesis 21:28, be fertile, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. And yet, we also believe that we have a duty to protect the environment, and we reconcile those two by saying, our first and primary focus is to, protect the earth, and then it's from that we get the right to own property. But nonetheless, within the past a little over a century, we've seen industrialization on a level beyond anything we've seen for the greater part of human history. And so on a practical level, what would you think is the most important thing that we could do to affirm the right to own property and to establish a factory or to own a big business, and yet also protect the environment? From a Catholic perspective, how can we have both of those things coexisting?
Well, that's a great question, and will test my my philosophical viewpoints a little bit. But I think that just as you cited the Bible about being able to subdue the earth and use it to our benefit, I think immediately to also doing unto others as you would want them to do unto you, in a big global sense, I think that provides us with a motivation to provide careful stewardship of our resources. Because, and I think that's what the Pope is getting at with the whole encyclical, in how are we going to continue human civilization in a way that praises God and uses the gifts that he gave us while not abusing the world or taking advantage of our fellow citizens. So, to me, I guess I would fall back on the very simple philosophy of, doing unto others as you would want them to do unto you. I would not want somebody to, dump a garbage dumpster in my backyard, and that's probably a really ridiculously simple example, but, philosophically, if we want to have these products, if we want this laptop computer or this microphone or that camera, we have to figure out a way to make it so that we don't harm the environment, and we don't harm our fellow man. So I think that's why the Pope wrote this encyclical. I think that is the message he's trying to get to us, is we need to wake up and we need to watch out for the earth and for one another.
And one last question.
Sure.
The concept that we have a duty to protect the environment is something codified in the teachings and doctrines of the Catholic Church. It's in the Catechism. We can infer that from various biblical passages. What is the difference in the emphasis in Pope Francis's recent encyclical? Is it just a difference in application, or is he bringing up an entirely new set of issues?
Wow. It's been a long time since I took a religion class, so I might not be the best person to answer that question. But again, I would rely on the challenges that the Pope puts into the encyclical and the statements that he makes about how important he feels that it is. And as the leader of the church on earth, I think that, that's where I would get my marching orders, if you will. I mean, quite frankly, I wouldn't personally bother to go back to any catechism to double check the Pope's feeling on the encyclical. I would say, I like what I've heard in the encyclical. I think he's right, and I'm, as Chris Rein, I'm going to follow it. Now, we have a couple of our esteemed faculty here in the audience that may have a little bit more theological training than I. Would you guys like to make any response to that?
Well, I'm no theologian, but you are.
Yeah, I wasn't gonna argue with you. You're no theologian. I think in some ways, and this is maybe the broader perspective of what the encyclical gives us, is because it's not just, and this is, I think, the misconception of the document. It's not just an encyclical about the environment. It's about what's the proper relationship between human beings and their creator and the creation that's around us. And so at the fundamental kind of level, that document is really about what does it mean to be in relationship to our God, to ourselves, and to each other, and to the world around us. And in as much as, going back to your earlier question, it's about trying to figure out what that balancing act is in terms of relationships with each other. Do we recognize that we owe something to each other in this life, in this world? And if we're not recognizing that, if we're not admitting it, then we're missing out on something that is basic to what it means to be human and what is basic to what it means to be a creation or a created being of God. Did you want to add anything? Because you're a biologist.
I mean, I think one of the things that the Holy Father is doing is, and you're right in saying that, private property is something that, we believe that humans have a right to, but not a right without limit. And I think the difference he might be making is to focus our attention on a balance that yeah, this is a good to be creative and to advance culture and advance technology, but to the extent that it harms other people or harms the environment, it's no longer this unbridled good. So I think his critique is about this unbridled capitalistic, technological, locomotive move forward, and focus our attention on the things that might have been understated or not adverted to in the past. What it's doing to the poor, what it's doing to the environment, what it's doing to the disenfranchised.
Great. Yes.
Environment. There's a second law of thermodynamics that God gave us that says that you can't. Your very existence will pollute. Your very existence will destroy a component of the environment. And so we can't do things without harm. But we have to do it with balance, with an understanding of sort of the total social value of our actions, I think. The second law of thermodynamics cripples me.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, and that's why, I spend a fair amount of time and kind of, praised the NEPA regulations, because that's what the NEPA regulations are all about, is balancing environmental impacts versus benefits, and in trying to ensure that the community gets, gets a favorable situation without an unfavorable, or by minimizing or balancing any unfavorable outcomes. And I just did want to say to Father Gabriel, thank you for making your remark, because, I think back to my early reasons for studying environmental science, and it was the old saying is I want to make sure that the beauty and all of the natural wonders of the world are still around for my children and my grandchildren. But I think you pointed out that it's much bigger than just me wanting it for my children or my grandchildren. I really need, and the Pope is asking us to want it for everybody, not only for everybody, but also for the earth itself. So I thanks for your remark on that.
I hope you don't mind someone in the audience being a little provocative.
Not at all.
It seems one would never guess, either from the encyclical or from your remarks, which I appreciate, that in fact, over the past 5-10 years, the United States has in fact reduced its carbon footprint materially. And that it has done so not, with all due respect, because of NEPA or layers and layers of expensive and cumbersome and time-consuming regulation. It's instead from the confluence of two factors, which it seems that many folks who have embraced this encyclical naturally view with suspicion. And they are, first of all, capitalism, which is to say putting one's money at risk. And the second is technology. And specifically, given the confluence of those two factors and the technological advances in horizontal drilling and fracking, in fact, we have been able to substitute natural gas for coal for much of our energy production. And it seems that there is insufficient appreciation for the other side of that word balance. And just one last point, which is we managed to do this not by destroying jobs, but by creating jobs, okay? So I just wondered if you would comment on my provocation.
Yeah, well, absolutely. In fact, I welcome it. I think it is really great observation. First, I'm only going to say this because of the invite for provocation. The really interesting thing, and I personally would love to see less regulation. I really would. But I would say that one of the reasons that we have taken, that our capitalistic society has taken a lot of the actions that we've taken, is that, in fact, the Clean Air Act, in one way, shape, or form, provided an impetus for that. And I would say that if you looked at the air quality in 1970 and looked at it today and saw what the Clean Air Act did during that period of time, you would probably agree that for good reason, that one of the reasons that our carbon emissions are so much less is because we've been working on these kinds of things. We've been working on all manner of air pollution. So I think that there's still a place for regulation, although I'd love to see us do without it. And I think that goes to the other side of the coin that you mentioned, and that is the capitalism and the innovation and the drive to do things better. I fully would support that. And I think that finding better ways to generate energy or use our resources, getting back to the statement from the gentleman over here about can we actually flush a toilet with a cup of water instead of a jug of water, that's great stuff. And if we can generate a megawatt of electricity with 1/10 the fuel today than we had to use 50 years ago, that's great. If 10 years from now we can do it without any fuel, that would be wonderful too. So I appreciate your comment, and I think it's a great remark, and it's all part of the discussion. And you're right, maybe when people talk about the encyclical, they try to look at the soft side of it, the side that says we're not doing as good a job as we could, and we need to be better at not degrading the environment. But people don't realize the benefits and the advances that we've made recently, and I think that we need to continue them. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Rein. We have a ton of food next door in the Center for Catholic and Religious Studies, so I invite all of you next door, but one last question, I guess.
We're having another talk on Laudato Si on Saturday, December 5th at 4:30 in Roy 105 by Dr. Jeffrey Bishop from St. Louis University. So everyone's welcome to that event as well, and there will be refreshments there as well. Thank you.
Well, good. Can I ask somebody to send me an email to remind me of that?
We have 3 more talks on this coming up.